I am going to share my screen. So let me just do that. Fabulous. Everybody should be able to see my screen. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me today. My name is Ricardo Kairios, and I'm going to do a fun webinar, I hope, on strengthening extension outreach, exploring health disparities and program barriers for LGBTQIA2S plus audiences. So I'm gonna do a little bit of like a lecture base today where I'm gonna do some slides, some background for us a bit, and then we're gonna have some engagement opportunities. But when things come up during today's presentation, please do feel free to throw them in the chat box, write them down, or we could like backtrack, remember what slide you might have had a question on, and I'd be happy to go back to that. And I'm excited to share this presentation today. This is one that I've done in the community a few times. I've done it with various nutrition groups. I've done it with a food security type of group. I've done it just even recently, actually, for the Department of Corrections. So not exactly the same slides, but just like an overview of the health needs, focusing on equity among the LGBTQIA2S plus population. As y'all know, I'm sure, being a member of this group, Workers Cooperative Extension is an affirmative action, equal opportunity employer. And I think that I might know everybody at this on this call at this point, but to do a quick introduction, my name is Ricardo Kairios. I'm the educator in Mercer County for the Department of Family and Community Health Sciences. I've been here for almost 2 years now in this position, so it's a really exciting time. And in this position as a Mercer County educator, I focus on community food systems with a specialization in food security and access and social determinants of health. And it's kind of like a joke to myself. I don't know if anybody else gets it, but social determinants of health, I feel like just means you do it all. It's a sprinkle of everything related to health, which is super exciting to me because it lets me think about what's related to food security and access, but in the bigger picture perspective, maybe. So I'll give some examples during today's presentation on that overlapping thing, right? Because maybe access to healthcare or, job security might affect also, of course, our food security and, other influences. And again, about myself, my background is in food and nutritional sciences. And I had the pleasure of working before this position with Rutgers for the expanded food and nutrition education program. And I also worked for a Head Start program in Central Jersey for a few years as our food service coordinator. So it's really close to me being in food systems and focusing on food security. I've always have. But in this position, with that focus on social determinants of health and looking at that bigger picture, it allows me to focus in on specific aspects within the community that influence health. And with that, in this presentation today, it really kind of aligned me with focusing on identities. And you'll hear about that in a little bit, but social identities is so important to people. And LGBTQIA2S plus is a part of a social identity. And as an individual, as a gay male, this is something I live with every single day. That is one of my favorite social identities. And it's nice that in this position, I have the autonomy to realize like, oh, is there anybody focusing on this type of identity within Extension? Are we realizing the influence this identity has on our population within Extension? And I kind of realized not a lot of people are talking about that. So that's one reason why I'm lucky to be able to be talking about that in my position. I kind of have that platform where, I see that there's a need for it, and maybe that's a good thing I dove into it, or maybe that's, we'll see how it works out. But I'm excited to shout that out here because I want us to think about social identities influence us all, and LGBTQIA2S plus is a huge part of our community. I mean, certain people say about 6-7% of the population may identify as that. We just did a survey in Mercer County with youth, about 25% of that population did. And I want us to think about during this presentation as Extension people, the population we serve. So in my head, I'm thinking like 3 groups here. We serve our community, which are, from 4-H, maybe are the youth that we serve, right? We serve students, and people that we mentor within the community, our volunteers that we're working with, that we are passing on leadership and giving them opportunities. I work with so many students. And then we also serve each other as professionals, supporting each other, collaborating together. So just keep in mind that this identity isn't just, the population we serve, but we also have to keep in mind, our colleagues that might have this identity and making sure that the systems we have are working internally and externally. So with that, we'll dig into that because I'm going to be talking about social identity a bit. I'm going to be playing a video soon that I'm going to make sure that everybody can hear. That gives a bit of a definition about the LGBTQIA2S plus population. And we're going to be thinking about, what influences health here? What causes these health disparities, especially those systematic issues related to bias, discrimination, and isms? And for this group, those are those influences, and not just this group, though. I want us to think in mind when I'm about to talk about this, and we have an upcoming webinar about intersectionality. We'll be working with Dr. Veronica Jones. That's going to dig into this more. But social identities is a part of so much that you'll see. And this idea of isms, discrimination, and bias influences not just our LGBTQIA2S population, but every aspect of social identity that we hear of. And then I'll share some frameworks. We're going to share some reflections and think about what policies and practices we could be doing here. So our background on social identity and social identity groups. So social identity is based on physical, social, and mental characteristics of individuals. So keep in mind, we have hundreds, I'm sure, of social identities we live with. And sometimes I don't think about that until we really realize it. I'll give an example. I didn't think of really my social identity being a first-generation college student much, even though my whole life that was a thing. I mean, to be honest, graduating high school was like the big, big goal. So going to college, my dad said, go to college. Any type of college, any type of trade I could have done. But I realized being a first-generation college student, that's a huge social identity. That's a huge influence on my life. Having, a win for myself, but also realizing the difference that I have colleagues of mine that they're third, fourth generation. They have family that were faculty members, that had higher education, that, had that understanding, that systematic way. So, that's an identity that I might not put down as my top 5 identity, but that is definitely an identity group that I'm proud of, that I have to acknowledge because I know that my father made sure, that was an identity that was huge in my life. My father worked his whole life to make sure that I was a college student, mentally trying to make sure I go to college. So, we could think about that. Now, I want you to think of some identities could be ascribed, like myself, that first-generation college student, I could claim that identity. Or some are ascribed or some are self-claimed. So ascribed is, putting that yourself in that group. So just think of what identities you might have been ascribed to. And sometimes I use race, ethnicity as an example for myself. That's an identity group that, I was told, hey, you're Puerto Rican, you're Greek. This is who you are. And when I was younger, I didn't have to question that. I'm like, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Greek, I'm a part of that group. Being older, realizing what it is to be mixed race actually started making me question that, what is that even? But, that's an identity group that I didn't have to figure out for myself. I was told that, and then it was claimed. When you look through this list, we could think about ourselves with society on what's self-claimed and what's ascribed. And sometimes with that, I joke about gender reveal parties. That's a very cleared, ascribed identity that we are given that identity from birth, right? We could think about identity in this 2-step process. There's identity confusion and identity synthesis, okay? Identity confusion is when we're really actually trying to figure out, where we are with those options of, are we this or that? So I'll give another example. I talked about being Puerto Rican Greek, right? From birth, I didn't really have to question, what is that? I had identity synthesis. I wasn't really confused. I didn't have a lot of time being like, what am I? What am I? Something like sexual orientation, I've been ascribed being straight since I was born. So when I'm questioning my own sexual identity, sexual orientation, that's where I was at a level of identity confusion, being like, oh, I'm ascribed this, I'm ascribed straight, but like, I don't feel that way. It's not natural to me. And until I get to that point of really realizing, what am I? I'm in that confusing state. And I want to let you all know, the longer we're in that confusing state, it influences our health in many ways. Influences, especially our mental health, because it causes that doubt, it causes that insecurity, not being confident. Just think about how important it is being confident. So I love using myself as examples, that's the best way to do it. So that identity confusion, some people might, come out. We always come out in many ways, right? But some people might realize, like, I'll sorry to always use my husband as an example. At 16, he said, I have identity synthesis. I'm a gay man, which is two identities, right? Cisgender male and gay. So my sexual orientation, right? Now he's identity synthesis. He's not worried nothing. That's out there now. And for the rest of that growth, he's good. Versus me, I came out at 25. I had that confusion. I didn't get that identity synthesis until 26, where I found that level of confidence to be like, oh, I know what I am. So that's just an example of how long somebody could be in that zone where, whether it's for many reasons why they might not be able to necessarily claim it or synthesize it or own it that way, but really, kind of showing those two examples of you could be in that zone. And I mentioned earlier, identities could be personally claimed, but not often announced or easily visible or ascribed. So as an example, I always use myself, I have an autoimmune disease. We called it a ghost disease when I was younger. That's something where you might not be able to look at me unless maybe it's a bad day that I'm like, using a walker or something, that you could see I have a physical disability. But I joke with friends, if I turn purple, I'd be purple every day because I live with it every day. So that might be an identity that you might not see that I could personally share with y'all. And you could think about that in many ways. Religion's sometimes like that, right? Some people self-claim religion very obviously. Some people, you don't know. You might not know that until they share that with you. And that last bullet is, I almost feel like a verge of this one a little bit, that identities may be kept confidential for purposes of self-safety. And especially we're about to talk about the LGBTQIA2S plus community. That's a perfect example of not all identities people might feel comfortable or safe to be sharing out loud. And it's just so funny because that also leads us back to that first bullet, right? Of identities are ascribed or self-claimed, right? Because I say not everybody within this community might feel comfortable, but then you might always have people that, might ascribe you in that community anyway, right? And I'm sure people within this community have their own thoughts or memories of people, might be calling them out, even though they might not even feel safe. I have memories of, people calling me out saying, you're going to tell us you're gay? And me in that environment, not feeling safe to say it at all. I was at that conference last Monday with a group of people giving a presentation, and it was an LGBTQ event, right? But there was somebody there that works for an agency that told me they don't feel comfortable in a workplace sharing that knowledge. They don't feel comfortable with their clientele knowing that. And intersectionality is a really big deal because, they feel safety issues. And that overlap with their sexual orientation and their gender identity, being a female, and people treating them certain ways. And that overlaps with, with many different layers here of safety. So I just want to shout that out. It's a very interesting thing. There's a training where people say, announce your pronouns in the beginning. And it's a big thing. It's a big training, especially they say it with you. State your pronouns so people are comfortable. It's a very interesting thing because I almost think for gender identity, you're almost saying claim. And it's almost like if we were in a circle, state your sexual orientation, go around. That might not be an appropriate behavior because, who would just say, share that with a group of people, off the bat. And in a way, this is used to help promote, but in a way you think about safety, is this always a place where people might in the workplace feel like that? Or people might in, the community feel that way. So as much as we want to ensure promotion, we also want to be mindful that even when we think people feel comfortable, they might not want to share personal identities for many reasons. So with that, I'm sure y'all have been thinking, what identities are important to you? Just what identities, lead your life every day. And then I want you to think, are identities important? Because people are like, is this important to talk about? Are identities important? What are your top few identities? Is that important to you, in your life? I'm going to play this video for us now to focus in a bit more on our LGBTQ population. Let me make sure I'm optimizing for video for y'all, and let me share.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today. Before we get started with today's live content, we want to talk about some basic terminology that is important to know when working with people who have diverse sexual orientations or diverse gender identities. There are 4 elements of identity that you will need to know: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. First is sex assigned at birth, which is based on physical anatomy. This is often assigned before or immediately after birth by looking at the baby's anatomy. The most typical sex assigned at birth is either female or male, but there are other variations of sex worth noting. Variation in sex characteristics can be variations among hormones, chromosomes, or anatomy. The term intersex is used as an umbrella term for those born with varying sex characteristics. About 1 in every 100 people are born intersex. That's more common than most people think. So contrary to popular belief, there are in fact more sexes than just male or female. The next important term to know is gender identity. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of their own gender. All people have a gender identity, though not many people think about it. Gender identity is how you feel about your gender and your role in your culture's gendered practices. Gendered practices vary from culture to culture, so there isn't only one way to define being a girl, woman, boy, man, or any other gender. Gender identity forms very early in childhood, with some science pointing to as early as 2 years old. When young children start to say, "I'm a boy" or "I am a girl," they are describing how they feel about their own gender. I would like to explain a few key terms related to gender identity. The word cisgender describes a person whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth match. The word transgender describes a person whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth. The term transgender is also an umbrella term for gender identities like gender fluid, non-binary, and agender. For more information on these terms, click the glossary link in the description. The next term you will want to know is gender expression. Gender expression describes how people express their gender externally. This could be through clothing, hobbies, mannerisms, or hairstyles. Gender expression and the expectations around expression have changed over time, and they may change day to day depending on how a person feels. Sometimes, one might dress more masculine one day and then decide to dress more feminine the next day. It's important to note that gender expression does not tell us how someone identifies their gender, and it is best not to assume who someone is based on their style of clothing. It's best to ask the person how they identify. Lastly, we will talk about sexual orientation. Sexual orientation describes feelings of attraction. Think back to when you had your last crush. What were the feelings you had? Maybe you felt excited when you saw the person you liked. Maybe you got nervous or shy around them. Or maybe your heart raced and you had attraction. Think back to when you had your last crush. What were the feelings you had? Maybe butterflies, These are all feelings of attraction. Attraction can mean different things to different people, but one thing to note is that these feelings are not a choice or something someone can control. We cannot tell our heart to slow down or our butterflies to go away. Sexual orientation can start to form around early childhood. Think back to when you had your very first crush. This is when your sexual orientation started to develop. Common terms you hear associated with sexual orientation are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, and straight. Lesbian describes a girl or woman who is primarily attracted to other girls or women. Gay describes boys or men who are primarily attracted to other boys or men, but this term is also used by anyone who is attracted to the same gender. Bisexual refers to people who are attracted to their own gender as well as other genders. Pansexual refers to someone who is attracted to people regardless of gender. Asexual is used to describe someone who may not feel sexual attraction to any gender. This does not mean that the person doesn't want to be in relationships. It just means that the element of sexual attraction is absent. You might have also heard the term queer. Queer is used as an umbrella term that can only be defined by the individual using it. The term continues to be hurtful to some people, especially older populations who experience this term as a slur. However, some people use this term as a source of pride and a symbol of determination. It's always best to use the term only if the person self-identifies as queer, and if the person gives you permission to refer to them in that way. Lastly, some people identify as straight, which means they are attracted to people of the opposite gender. Now that you have some basic terminology under your belt, you're ready to jump into more specific content to get to know this population's experiences better, and to gain skills on how to serve them best.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch that video. I hope that there was a few things maybe y'all learned about maybe a few terms or such. Let me just take over one more second. So sorry for 1 second. Okay, awesome. Great, let's continue on, y'all. So, now that we learned a little bit more about the population and such, and we learned a little bit more about social identity, I'm going to do a quick background on health equity and social justice a bit. So, as per the World Health Organization, they describe equity as the absence of unfair, avoidable, or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, demographically, or geographically, or by other dimensions of inequality, sex, gender, ethnicity, disability, or sexual orientation. So just think about avoiding any unfair, avoidable, or remediable differences, right? And that aspect of health equity is that, that really focus on the full potential for health and well-being. So with that, and thinking about health disparities, this has us thinking a little bit about how health disparities are inequitable and are directly related to the historical and current unequal distribution of social, political, economic, and environmental resources. So just to let you all know, why are there these differences a little bit? So I just gotta, explain those causes of the health disparities by focusing on those isms and phobias. And especially since we're talking about our LGBTQ community, this is where we're talking about those we're talking about homophobia, transphobia, biphobia. And we also know about other isms like racism, sexism, classism, ableism. Something I want us to keep in mind is that individuals could experience multiple layers of this, right? So if you experience homophobia, that doesn't mean you can't experience racism. And, if you're somebody who also may experience ableism or classism, you could experience it all, right? And the issues is that by bias and discrimination, cuts off access to healthcare services and just access and services in general. Since I mentioned bias, I want us to keep in mind there's two types of bias. A bias is a personal or unreasoned judgment of prejudice. And I want to let us think about we have biases that we are trained in our brain, right? Everything we know we get taught at some point, right? So there's two types, like I said, explicit, meaning intentional, conscious, directly expressed. Sometimes like these are the things that we just hear in a meeting and we're just like, I can't believe, did they just say that out loud? I can't believe that person just said that out loud. Or, when I said earlier on how people in the LGBTQ community, people out them for them. Those are usually, we hear those explicit bias or statements. Sometimes it's hard to tell when it's explicit or implicit. I will share that. Because implicit means you're unaware, it's subconscious, indirectly expressed. So implicit is that like people didn't really even realize maybe they did it. They didn't realize that their bias is something that was even there. I kind of said earlier that we're trained with these biases because it's a part of a systematic thing. It's in society. So we are growing as people, and society also changes with time, okay? So I just want to kind of give that heads up that, as time changes and we change, hopefully we start realizing these implicit biases here and there. But it really takes that conscience, that self-reflection, and that acknowledgement of especially these different identities. Like if there are certain identities that you didn't even know of, how would you know you have a bias on them? So we just explained LGBTQIA2S plus population. If you were totally unaware of these certain things, you might not be aware that you have a mindset on how you thought of a perception of, one of these definitions. And it was actually a bias you were taught. This next slide is a great one that Dr. Jones shared with me at one point that kind of explains equality, equity, and justice. And as said, we might be familiar with this picture. A lot of people are of the image of the fence. With the picture on the left shows equality. Everybody gets the same height, the same box. And it clearly does not work because the person on the right cannot see. Equity is that they get what they need, right? They all get what they need, and now everybody could see, which is great. But justice is removing the issue itself, saying we need to remove the fence and cause a fence that people could all see through so that there's no need for equality or equity focus if the justice, the actual issue is addressed. So this, in a lot of ways, we need to think on like that systematic level, because we just talked about biases being ingrained with us, right? Why are they ingrained? Why are they ingrained in our head? Is it, systematic? Is it interpersonal things we share? Is it a systematic perspective we were taught? So that's it's an interesting thing of that justice, addressing that big picture perspective. I did share, I put a little perspective on social determinants of health, and healthy people 2030 in the United States, when we think of health equity, we think of the social determinants of health. How do we think about the overall picture of well-being and health in the whole person? And then we put it in these 5 categories here: economic stability, social and community context, healthcare access and equality, neighborhood and built environment, and education access and quality. Now, these are things that, you could dig into on your own and such, but these are things that when we think of social identities and we think of identity in the LGBTQ, we have to think of every aspect of these social determinants. There could be how does bias, how does stigma, how do these isms influence somebody's experience, right? And there's a lot of conversations around this. I mean, education, anybody working with youth, how are bias and stigma attacking youth, LGBTQ youth? That's the whole policy right there. I'm happy I don't live in Florida. but who knows nationally? So I'm just saying, when we think about our population, think about education, equity, and equality, we definitely have to think about, first of all, youth. There's a lot of policies out there specific about this population, but we also have to think about those implicit systems and such. I used to work at Head Start, the younger youth, 0 to 5. The gender identity and norms we teach them from birth is every day. Girls line up this way, boys line up this way. I mean, that's some part of that bigger picture where we talk about justice that I'm like, I don't even know how to have that conversation with the education team. And at that point, I wasn't as familiar with this area, but that's a systematic thing that, like, how would they change their language and maybe, not say boys and girls, and because I say that's an ascribed identity. I'm sure that the girls and boys or youth or whomever, at young in age may, be, have that identity synthesis for a bit, but implementing that system is that itself biased. We're automatically teaching. It's not like we're even given a third option, right? And by the way, when it was given those definitions, when it talked about the non-binary, the trans audiences, I want to just shout out that there was a conversation on how some of these are actually related to cultural norms for a lot of populations. Like the two-spirit identity is not anything new to the indigenous population. That is something that is aligned with their spiritual beliefs and certain populations that believe in that for centuries. And same with there's a group in India that has that same third population that is a part of their spiritual, it's part of their beliefs. So I'm just saying, so it's not just, us saying, oh, our youth are acknowledging there's this third thing. There could be a family in a Head Start program that their own beliefs have that third identity that is now enrolled in that Head Start program, that they're being trained this U.S. systematic perspective of girl and boy, and that's not even existent for them. So, this is where identities overlap so much. And we could go through this list forever here, but there's just, in my opinion, like education, healthcare access, these are such big, obvious things that affect this population. Things that might not be so obvious, like social, like economic stability, employment. I mean, I myself know that there was a situation, I wasn't even out of the closet at the time, where I had a supervisor screaming at me once, screaming at me. It almost got physical. And I didn't even realize that afterwards, I found out from all my colleagues that he was calling me all these slurs, LGBTQ slurs against me all the time, belittling me. I wasn't even out. If you would ask me at the time, it would be like straight, straight, straight. And, so it's just so funny. He I wasn't safe to be out. It wasn't even a thing like that. But that could have been something where like I could have lost my job. If I felt intimidated and didn't feel comfortable to go to HR, and lucky I had an HR that actually fired this person because it wasn't a safe environment, I could have had to quit because I wasn't safe. And then what? Then I couldn't pay bills. Then I couldn't go to college because I might not have a car to pay that bill. It would affect my ability to pay any bill that maybe I had to drop out of school at one point. So education overlaps here with that economic stability so much. And these are nuanced ways that aren't so easy to call out a policy issue. The policy, the don't say gay in Florida policy, is very easy to call out. These nuanced things of employment, I do some research with LGBTQ students, college students, where they tell me nuances of believing that certain students that have family norms get certain job opportunities more, like certain research assistants, because they say, oh, you have a family, you have a wife, you're trying to plan a family at one point. And they said, I have a boyfriend. Do I not have income needs? Do I not need a job too? Like, so certain nuances like that aren't really so easily shout outable. And I also want to say too, like, obviously here, would you say like social and community context, it puts discrimination right out there in the forefront. To continue on, y'all, I always like to share the National Framework for Health, Equity, and Well-Being by the Extension Foundation. I believe they're still called, or Extension Services. But I really like this because we should all be looking at this report and reading it down, but it really does a great way of explaining, the focus on the health equity, like I was saying in the center. And they talk about all these social, and they say what cooperative extension's role is here. But then they talk about all the social determinants here. They include a bigger description because in the US we have those five, but there's a bigger description. And then they consider what are those norms? What are the policies? What's the root causes of structural inequities here? So these are things that in order to do our job correctly, we need to consider this. And especially, an extension is an interesting thing. I think I'm probably one of the newest departments in extension. It's not such a historical department where 4-H is so youth focused and family focused that it's historical history. There's a history behind that. FCHS, I feel like there's a lot of newer nuance to that. So the reason that I'm explaining that is that for 4-H, I could imagine how much built history of norms are on that program and how to stay relevant and to stay in current times. How do you continue to adapt and maybe sometimes shed some of those norms that might need to be shed versus having that proud history, I say that because I don't know if we reflect back and think of some of the programs offered, I'm sure if we look at programs in the 1980s, 70s, 60s, it's talking about women and youth, women and girls. I know when I used to work in FNAP became a thing, the Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program, because 4-H only had one program on nutrition, and it was a homemaker program for women and girls. That in itself has many identity things right there. Women and girls in the home, that's what we do. We got to teach you how to cook, right? And that's why they created FNAP. So alone, I have that knowledge and knowing, well, 4-H at one point try to teach women and girls how to be homemakers, right? So I know we grew so much. And I'm not saying that some of these things shouldn't stay constant, but, if we are still having programs like sewing programs, and if they're sewing certain things, are we marketing them in an inclusive way? Or do we have programs marketed towards the women and girls still? I don't know. So that's why we should think back, and by the way, y'all, I want to be cognizant of time and such. So I just want to show you just a few quick things about identity before, I dive into our small group discussion here. But as we mentioned earlier, there's different levels to identity, so many different types of identities out there. But something that we got to keep in mind is that our identities are put into groups naturally. There's target groups and there's non-target groups. This is natural. It's a natural process. Where the non-target groups are those groups that are historically likely to hold social and economic or political privilege. So when we talk about LGBTQ, that automatic, the heterosexual group. When we talk about trans and non-binary, that cisgender group, cis-normative group is that non-target group. It is easy to live life. They don't often have to question a lot. It's not easiest. Let me take that back. It's not easiest. There's different levels of identity. We all live different things, right? But for that perspective, we live in a society where it's a little bit easier to live life, a little bit easier, right? Versus a target group, these are the populations that are also marginalized and are also treated less than due to aspects. So every identity group has a split. So this amazing chart that was shared by an extension training program kind of shows you that small clip of the types of groups and how they might split into target and non-target groups. This is also really important for intersectionality because we all have multiple identities, right? So this isn't something that we're finding our identity and we're now charging, saying, this is my target group I'm a part of, right? But this is something that we're doing self-reflections, right? And not all of these are, maybe the same magnitude. Maybe, certain things in life, rankism, like college degrees, maybe not everybody might not experience that. But you might be in a situation where college degrees is a constant thing where I actually know, we're in academia. Rankism is probably a huge thing where people, without college degrees feel less than the people that have the degrees, right? But somebody might experience that rankism issue and then might also experience, being in that target group of LGBTQ where they don't feel safe to share certain things about their identity. And they might not be like me right now who's screaming it. They might be the type to be like, no, I work with certain I need to separate for certain reasons, right? So I just want to say these are things that we have to like keep in mind. And this is helpful for us when we think about our populations that we serve and how, you know, where is our privilege that we're serving? I'm Hispanic and I'm Puerto Rican, and I always use myself as an example that I fall in privilege in a lot of ways compared to many other types of Hispanics and many other Puerto Ricans, being someone who's half white and being someone who my first language is English and being someone who was raised in New Jersey. Like there's many parts of my privilege that stick out compared to other Hispanics. That is it's something I have to realize when I work with Hispanic groups that, I come with different privileges too. So as always, it's really great to do self-reflections, you know, and with this population, one self-reflection is, what is my perception of LGBTQIA2S individuals? And how is it shaped by cultural expectations, traditions, and stereotypes? Again, stereotypes are there in society. They're shared by family members, by friends. People share stereotypes and it gets passed on by telephone. And these are things like that create those biases that we project. We think that we know something and we project it, but not everybody's the same. I can't tell you how to treat an LGBTQ person because everybody's different. There's certain things that we could do, but it's always that. It's not cookie cutter. What are my biases and where might overlap? By the way, y'all, these biases are internalized against our own groups. I have a whole discussion on internalized bias within LGBTQ populations and go back to that list of identities because I know as a gay male, lookism, whew, is a huge thing, and racism is a huge thing among LGBTQ populations. And these are things that, it's not just, we're talking about people that aren't a part of the group. We need people within the groups to be self-reflecting on our biases, to be creating safe spaces and inclusive spaces that are trying to avoid those biases and avoid those stereotypes. And especially with us in extension, how is this overlapping with our work? Where is my privilege overlapping? How, like, maybe certain programs we need to think of and think to ourselves, like, oh, is this a program that I didn't even realize is like, I created it just fresh with the privilege of my brain and people come to it, but they're all also having the same type of privilege. And I didn't even realize stepping out of my privilege that this is actually excluding a whole group of people. There could be people with similar privileges as you that if you're running a successful program, is that truly a successful program that is inclusive to all the people in the community? Or, are we just getting a mixed group? And those are things that we need to think about. So I want to thank everybody for this time spent with me. I just want to share a few more things with y'all. I have a recent fact sheet I just published about how to think about these different aspects of social determinants of health, but also supporting our LGBTQ population. So I'm going to be out here talking about this fact sheet all the time. I'm happy to talk more about this if there's any questions. I'm also going to put this in a chat box too. There's an incredible book out there, Grassroots Engagement and Social Justice Through Cooperative Extension. It has a whole chapter on this. And, I really appreciate these writers talking about this, and they acknowledge that, although extensions for civil human rights issues, the reality that LGBTQ acceptance has complex resistance, especially within something such as 4-H and extension. Much of the resistance based on religious and cultural beliefs. So, religion is and cultural is an identity group, right? So identity is important, right? So we're saying that from this perspective, much of that is due to one's identity not, allowing this. And I want to let y'all know, religious trauma and religious impact came up as a whole discussion in my meeting last week. So that would be an itself thing for itself. And thank y'all. Here's my email if anybody wants to chat about this. Again, there's so many future discussions. There's a lot of discussions for caregiver resources that are needed. So especially when we talk about 4-H, oh my goodness, there could be a whole dialogue, a whole panel on working with families, internally with, it could be families, it could be, youth, or it could be people that are in our household that, we're trying to be support figures for. So I came out with one fact sheet, but there are a lot more resources needed. And again, thank you everybody for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wow, thank you, Ricardo. My head is sort of brimming now. My brain is full of lots of information. And do you have any suggestions for our extension profession colleagues about how to approach working with folks who might be different than ourselves or different than our typical population?
Yeah. So a few things from there. One would be, in my fact sheet, it talks about there's a few steps in for like respecting identity. Um, being like one thing is to kind of like learn about the population a little bit. Not everybody's the same, but again, we're research people, right? Has there been any research out there that talks about norms? One thing is to try to include as much like inclusive language as possible. So if it's something that isn't, like you said, typical, but we're trying to engage within a certain population, especially if we're talking about LGBTQ, what does our language look like on our forms? How is our lesson plans developed? Are they developed in a way? And again, our population's already within our classes. So if we're talking about just making sure we're updating it as a best practice, we could be looking at the lessons we're teaching in general and saying, is there anything that we could just slightly cut out or avoid that might promote that systematic perspective, that might not align 100% with the, LGBTQ? I say that in terms of if saying, mom and dad or girlfriend or boyfriend, it's just a whole program about something like that for youth. I don't know what's out there. That might be something where you're going to have to think about the language. um there is another thing about implicit bias. We should all be doing implicit bias tests, and Harvard has an amazing implicit bias test all about all different types of identities. So you could go on there about religion, about age, about culture, about, Hispanic populations, but they have one on LGBTQ. I think it's separate. So I think they might have one on gender expression, gender identity. And those are things that we should do. I mean, especially we should all, like I said, the population's there. 25% at one school with youth. So if all 4-H agents did this test, this is something that I did one on age. I was insulted because it told me, I was like, hey, you're on a thing, you might be ageist. And I was like, what? But, the instructor said, go read a book on it. So reading a book about it, becoming educated, listening to a podcast about it, these are things that you could check in on then later on, but it's never to a point that we're fully aware too. So we just got to think about that a little bit. Also, certain language, like it's so interesting because I know that in my office, like somebody kind of mentioned that my audience wasn't like the traditional audience, right? But there's also certain things like when they said traditional, that is like a trigger to me. Because that's like when I was getting married, traditional was the biggest trigger for like it's always like, oh, we're non-traditional, we're non-traditional. What is that meaning? Is that historical norm this is a traditional? Actually, it actually became a trigger at one point too, because one of my best friends said that they wouldn't have me in their wedding because they're having a traditional wedding. So it's almost like when we talk about typical, traditional, our audience, like this is our audience already, you know, um, it's kind of that's what we got to like get people to realize. And it's also something in my perspective that this I didn't share this before, and I kind of should have, just as another visual thing that when we talk about this, but like society changes, right? Things change, and this is a great perspective on the social ecological model. One thing here missing is time-wise, but just something to keep in mind is that was it available 50 years ago in programming for people to be themselves so openly? Was that survey available 50 years ago in programming to do a youth survey to figure out 25% of the population? So just saying, like, that population could have always been there, but that environment to have that identity may not have always been typically available. You know what I mean? So that's also just another way of kind of that. That's how I think about it too. I hope that was helpful to you at all, but definitely check out that fact sheet and definitely those implicit bias things really help us be aware. There's so many great books, podcasts, YouTube videos. I love listening to things. These are things too for many different types of identities. So that was that thing with the age comment. I got the audio for the book. I had to drive to Newark for an hour. I was listening to it the whole time. Um, yeah, so those are some things. Um, if it comes to terms with changing the dynamic internally and trying to talk about like the structure itself, I would like to say there could be maybe a whole like training on that, on how to like, change dialogue. But one thing is for myself, I would say is owning yourself is the best way. Leading by example. So if you're doing it and you're using the language and you're doing it and your colleagues aren't, but you're doing it, they're going to be learning and they're going to be realizing that. So I will just say as a small blurb there that like um by leading by example, by making that change yourself, like you are making the change that others may follow.
Right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Are there other questions?
It was awesome, y'all. I appreciate you having me here. Thank you so much. I said I wasn't going to talk for too long, but I really did go off for about 50 minutes.
No, that was wonderful. Could you go to the slide that has your contact information on it again?
Absolutely.
And oh, Rebecca does have a question. When you have a group of teenagers and sometimes they are mean, in your experience, how could you tell teens about how to respect others?
This is a great question. Honestly, this is something that you should really be on the same page with your with. So you might not, I know in FNEP, you're not the authority, your teachers are. So you should have a plan in place with your teachers on what is their practice. And that might be something they might not have one. And you might have to tell them, I need a practice in place that if somebody says something, I need to be sure to be the one to say, like, this is what we say, this is inappropriate, or something like that. Um, that might be in different settings for you because you might have a teacher that has that language and you might then be in a setting that they don't have that, they're not ready. But I would definitely, especially as a leader in that classroom and the authority figure too, because as an adult and a person in the classroom, I would definitely say, hey, that's not really acceptable to me. This is a whole dialogue, though, on the conversation with youth. I think that could be a really great conversation in the future because I'm sure that there could be some research I could get you on best practices to engage youth on this conversation. Um, do you have any thoughts sharing yourself on just dialogue in general? Because I think this goes beyond LGBTQ, but just race. What if somebody said something inappropriate on race in a 4-H organization? What would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing that we do with, or at least the leadership programs I conduct, we actually start with a group agreement. And I often am bringing youth together that don't know one another, and I don't know them very well. So I'd like to say, in this space, what are the things that we're going to agree upon? What are we looking to do here today? Besides learn about leadership, we're going to respect others. We're going to listen to everyone. We're going to try and have fun. We're going to, so we come up with this almost, you had used the word practice in place of how is it that we're going to be together here in this space? And some of my trainings are 7 hours long. So we're spending a whole day together. There's one program I do that we end up spending about 20 hours together. So you get to know each other a little bit. But I think that group agreement is you're coming in saying, this is who I am. These are my expectations. How do we mold them together with all of yours? And so often it goes well, but I had a training where some young ladies, they were from a very different part of New Jersey, South Jersey, very rural, and they had very defined views on the world. And they were sort of putting them out there saying, well, if you live in a city, what do you even do? And it came across very judgmental. And I was trying to get them to sort of merge together with, yeah, we live in different places, we have different experiences, we look at the world very differently, but it doesn't make your situation better or theirs worse or what have you. So sometimes you kind of sit there and say, what should I say? Should I say anything? Should I let this play out? So sometimes it's playing it by ear, but absolutely, if someone is using language that's not appropriate, we're the ones, like you say, who are setting that appropriateness level. Like, here's what I expect when we come into this room and we work together.
I love that so much. I love the idea of the group agreement, honestly. I don't know if FNEP has that. And Steve, I see your hand is up. I do have another thought too on this, but go ahead, Steve.
No, it kind of building off what Sharon's saying, is there some sort of tool or checklist that we can use to determine the bias, not within what we're bringing to the class, but in the program in general? And the reason I asked that is I hadn't thought about it before, but a lot of our programming that we do in natural resources is really geared at like sustainable landscaping. And that's great if you're a homeowner, but what if you're not a homeowner, but you still have like plants, or you're a renter? So it's like, oh, really, that's not good for those people. So is there some sort of checklist that we can have in our own programming to kind of go through and be like, okay, does this meet the needs of everybody, kind of thing?
I love that. And honestly, I will tell you, I've been wanting to make an inclusivity checklist for a year now because it's come up with community programs. We did like a queer health event and people were coming with material that I'm like, if I had a checklist, I could have sent people to be like, let's think about this. But I think specifically for this audience, that would be super useful. But in general, I think like a checklist for this, that sounds like an awesome fact sheet collab, possibly. This is also something that you might not know about it until you're the one. So I might not know your situations because you're the one doing it. You're the one out there seeing it. But maybe a checklist to help think about certain things is super useful. I would love to follow up on that, Steve. And if you want to help me put that together as a fact sheet collab, that sounds like something all three of us could do.
Yeah, I'd be happy to let you be first author because you're going for tenure, so you could.
Thank you. I know that our time is up, y'all, but there was just one more thing I kind of wanted to shout out to with that youth perspective. Youth is so interesting because sometimes when you have youth that could seem not as respectful, to me, those have been the ones that need the most attention, the ones that might be sometimes might be acting up because they feel the most connected. I can't believe how many times I walked away from a group where the youth that was acting up was so excited to see me in the hallway and wave. So these are things with you too, kind of like thinking about this. I think I could follow up with a tool for this too. But also, there was one more thing about you too, about being mindful on how we call people in. Because especially with youth, like we might not want to call out something as being disrespectful, rather than there could be a way of calling in, a way to say it in a nicer way, or, are using that as an example to improve a practice. So sometimes I do that with certain groups when conversations will come up and I'll be like, oh, so if we had a guideline or a group guideline and something comes up, we're not trying to call them out for breaking it, but oh, that's a great discussion, y'all. So that brings us to a group guidelines, and that's a good example. Because those are things that youth might have all those bias that they're not realizing are bias. And to them, it might even get defensive. Sometimes we get people get defensive with bias, right? Or with, us trying to change. So especially around that youth perspective, it's very easy to share that explicit bias unintentionally. So always approaching it as that constructive way to promote knowledge and improvement. Thanks, y'all. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Ricardo. I've been recording all this time, so I'm going to stop it now.
Yeah, and we're good.